Hi everyone, I'm Robin. I'm one of the developers working on JIRA Studio. So Studio is our hosted suite of software. And Studio has one very interesting characteristic, particularly for plugin developers. And that's that if you're using Studio, you can't just take any plugin and upload it and install it in Studio. And this is because for security and stability considerations, we can't just run any arbitrary code in our hosted solution. So the question arises, what if you want to do some custom logic around your data in Studio? What if you want to do some kind of reporting around your data in Studio? What if you want to integrate it with some application running outside of Studio? What if you want to do some automation around Studio? So what I'd like to talk about is what I think is one of the best ways of going about doing this, which is by using the remote APIs that are provided by the applications that constitute Studio. So I use the term remote APIs to refer to all of the different types of APIs that can be accessed remotely by external apps to the applications. And so Studio includes the exact same set of APIs that are provided by the applications. So JIRA, Confluence, Bamboo, Fisheye, and Crucible. So a lot of the things I'm going to talk about could apply to the individual apps as well. And I think they're particularly useful within the context of Studio. And so one of the ways you can go about consuming these APIs is by implementing what I like to refer to as satellite applications. So these are apps that orbit around Studio and pull in the data that they need through these remote APIs. And after processing it, maybe beam some of that data back down into Studio, maybe broadcast it out to other destinations, right? So these could be web applications. They could be web applications, but they don't have to be. They can be all sorts of things. So for example, at Atlassian, we use an IRC bot called Marvin. There are a few different IRC bots floating around, but this is one of the ones we use. So this is an app that sits in our chat rooms and allows us to interact directly with JIRA from within the chat room. So we can raise issues, transition issues between states, and so on. So I think this is a pretty neat example of the kind of scope of different things that you can do with these remote APIs. And there's one other really interesting thing about Marvin, which is that it's written in Scala. And this leads me to one of the big benefits of writing these satellite apps as opposed to writing plugins. And that's that you're freed from the J2EE stack, right? You can use whatever language, whatever frameworks you prefer. You could go as far as, if you wanted to, you could go as far as writing satellite apps using shell scripts because you can interact with REST APIs using curl or whatever. So on the subject of doing things from shell scripts, have you come across the Atlassian CLI before? This is pretty neat. So this was written by Bob Swift, and in fact, it won the integration category of Codegeist back in 2009. And what it does essentially is that it takes the remote APIs exposed by the apps and re-exposes them in the form of a command line interface. So this means that if you have one-off operations that you need to do with data from Studio or from Atlassian Apps, you can do it very, very quickly and easily directly from your shell. So for example, this top one here, I'm grabbing the list of users from our instance of Studio that we use in Atlassian that hosts Studio itself and a bunch of other projects. And I'm just piping that into grep and grepping for my name. So that's what I use when I forget my email address, which doesn't happen often, only when I'm jet lagged. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do like that very easily and quickly with the CLI. So this is a neat example of what I'd call a satellite app that enables you to write other satellite apps. So that's the first big advantage of these types of applications. You can use the tools, the frameworks, the languages that you prefer. The second big advantage is that you can run them where you like, including, for example, behind your firewall. And now this is particularly useful if you have applications that are running behind your firewall and you want to integrate them somehow with Studio that's, of course, running out on the internet. So an example of this is a few years back, I worked for a company that used I guess, a legacy version control / issue tracking system that had been around since the late 80s. And so we had a huge amount of automation and infrastructure built around the system. But a few of us wanted to use JIRA. So we ended up building an app that sat in between the two and used JIRA SOAP API to ensure that any issues created in JIRA had a counterpart in the legacy system and vice versa. So this meant that we could continue to use JIRA without sacrificing the automation and infrastructure that had been built up around the legacy system. So that's the second big advantage of these satellite apps. So with those two advantages in mind, the choice, flexibility around language and the flexibility around where the app runs, I'd like to talk about some of these scenarios that I think are particularly relevant to satellite applications, namely reporting, integration type scenarios, and automation. So starting with the first one, this is a case where you have an existing reporting infrastructure, and you want to report on data that's sitting out in Studio. So here, clearly, the role of the satellite app is to go and grab this data and massage it into whatever shape it needs to be in for your reports, and then either feed it in or expose it to your reporting system. So in terms of what the interaction with Studio would look like, here's a very, very basic example. I'm using Groovy here. And in this case, I want to go and get some data from Crucible. So I'm using the REST API that's exposed by Crucible to go and get information about reviews. So I could plot, say, size of reviews or number of comments per reviews or something like that. So I'm using Groovy's HTTP builder, which is a very straightforward, simple HTTP client. And then I'm just making two requests. The first one is to log in, and the second one is to access the reviews resource provided by Crucible. And I'm using a filter on that, so I only get the reviews relevant to Project Beer Baron. And in fact, that filter has a whole bunch of other parameters that enable you to filter on all sorts of things to reduce the set of reviews that you get back. But what you actually get back is a whole bunch of XML with loads of information about those reviews. And then, of course, all you need to do is process it into the shape that you need for your reporting infrastructure. Say if you're using Google Spreadsheets, then maybe you just need to get it down to a CSV and then expose it on a URI that can be imported directly into Google Spreadsheets. And then, of course, you can do all of your reporting and graphing as you need to do. So what kinds of APIs are useful for these reporting type scenarios? So clearly, it's the read APIs, the ones that allow you to extract data. And all of the applications provide REST APIs that allow you to do this, to go and retrieve data. So you're able to access the stuff you'd expect. You can read information about issues in JIRA, pages in Confluence. I really, really like the Bamboo REST APIs. They're great. They allow you to get into a lot of detail about the builds, ranging from the duration of each build down to individual test results and everything. So really nice REST APIs in Bamboo. And of course, Fisheye and Crucible as well. Get all the details about your reviews, about your source code repository. So lots of good stuff there. So moving on to the second scenario, after reporting integration. So this is a much more general scenario, right? So this is about you have some system in your existing infrastructure that you want to tie in some way with Studio out on the internet. So let's say you have an existing CMS in your organization. Let's say you have a very well-established Drupal instance. So Drupal is a PHP content management system. And this is where all the head honchos in your organization go to get the information about what's going on in the company, what the hot issues are, and so on, because that's where they're used to going. That's where they've always been going. But you want to continue to track information about issues in JIRA, because that's what it makes sense to do. So how would you go about doing this? Well, you could envisage a satellite app whose role it is to listen for issues appearing on a filter provided by JIRA that will provide those hot issues. And then in response to those, when new ones come in, go and create pages inside of Drupal that link to those issues. So the head honchos can continue to go to Drupal, get the information they need, maybe even comment directly on the pages in Drupal. And then, of course, what you can do is update the issues to link back to the pages in Drupal so that everything is nice and cross-referenced and everything. So one way to do this would be to implement this satellite app effectively as a Drupal module. So Drupal provides the ability to invoke a bit of PHP code on a regular basis, kind of like a cron job, and that could go out and check the filter. So you'd be writing in PHP, and then you'd be in the context of Drupal, so you have access to all of the APIs to go and create entities in Drupal and so on. In terms of the interaction between the PHP code and JIRA, this is what it might look like. So in this case, I'm using the SOAP API provided by PHP, and it's very easy with PHP and with lots of language to get going with a SOAP client. Again, I'm just logging in with user Homer, password beer, and I've got my object that represents my, my client to go out to my JIRA instance. And as soon as I've got hold of that, then I get access to a whole load of methods that allow me to go and get issues, manipulate those issues, update the issues, and so on. By the way, these are pretty simple examples, but I am going through them very fast. What I'll do at the end is I'll give you a link that will link off to a Bitbucket repository where you can go and access all of these samples and have a closer look at them. So we make extensive use of these integration type APIs in Atlassian. If you've ever used the IDE connectors, you'll know that they provide very rich integration between IDEs and pretty much every Atlassian app. And these use the exact same APIs that we've been talking about, right? Another good example is Hercules. So this is a log file analyzer, which looks for patterns representing known issues in log files from Confluence and JIRA and so on. And the way this works is by connecting out to a knowledge base that's maintained by our support engineers. So the knowledge base is a Confluence wiki. And when support engineers identify issues that can be identified by regular expressions in log files, then they simply enter that regular expression. And Hercules updates itself from that knowledge base with these regular expressions, so it keeps up to date with the very freshest information about these known issues. So another pretty cool use of remote APIs. So again, which APIs are useful in the context of integration? Well, clearly all of the read APIs we've talked about previously, but in the context of integration, you might want to do some writing as well. Now, with JIRA and Confluence, at the moment, the REST APIs are pretty much read-only to a large degree. So it's likely that you'll need to use the SOAP or XML RPC APIs to actually do write operations on your data. Nonetheless, I'd recommend starting off with the REST APIs to see if you can do what you need to do with those. The reason being that this is the direction we're focusing on. This is what we're going to be enhancing in the future. And also, the REST APIs have very good consistency across the products in terms of the conventions we're using, in terms of the documentation, and so on. So start with the REST APIs, drop down to SOAP or XML RPC if you need to for JIRA and Confluence. Bamboo, Fisheye, Crucible, you should be able to do what you need through the REST APIs. Cool. So moving on to the very last scenario, which is automation. Again, this is a very general category, and if you saw the talk this morning by Dave about automation with Python, he had a lot of detailed examples with that. If you didn't see it, check it out. Go and see the video or the slides. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So automation could be about triggering events in Studio in response to things happening in your infrastructure, or the other way around, listening out for events in Studio and triggering stuff in your infrastructure in response to that. So I thought maybe a global search and replace in Confluence is a very kind of simple example of a form of automation. Now, these are apparently 3 of the most annoying phrases in the English language. I'm not so sure. I think they all have their legitimate uses, particularly the last one. But I thought what I'd do, since they're so annoying, is I'd see if I can write a script that goes and censors them out in a Confluence instance by replacing them with that cool Unicode character that looks like someone's taken a black marker pen to it and just censored it out. I considered a slight variation on this, where I would look for any page with the word REST in the title and automatically append this comment saying that it's not actually REST. If you've written the REST API, you might know what I mean. But anyway, in either case, this is an example of how you might go about doing this. In this case, I'm using Ruby, and I'm using the XML RPC API. And in fact, I'm using a wrapper called Confluence for R, which is a very simple, small wrapper that makes accessing the XML RPC APIs even easier from Ruby. So same pattern again. I just log in, and I end up with an object representing my server. And from there, once again, I have access to all of my methods to go and search on the server, to go and update pages, retrieve pages, and so on. And changing the content of a page is literally just a string replace on the content element in the page. So very straightforward stuff. So again, which APIs are useful? So all of the ones we've talked about so far. And feeds. Feeds are really useful tools when it comes to automation because they allow you to listen out for events happening inside the Atlassian apps. So pretty much all of the feeds, all of the applications have feeds of some type or another that allow you to access events happening inside those particular applications. So to wrap up, and on the subject of feeds, I wanted to give a shout out to activity streams, which are kind of like feeds on steroids, right? They grab events happening in all of the apps and bring them into a single stream that provides a lot of configurability, a lot of information about those events that are happening in the apps. So again, streams, another very, very useful tool for automation from satellite applications. So with that, thank you very much. Here's the link I promised earlier. By the way, we have lots of ideas to improve these integrations between external apps and Studio to make this even more rich. But in the meantime, check out the remote APIs. If you haven't used them before, this link will give you a really good starting point. And this is my call to action. I think there's been a lot of really awesome stuff done with the remote APIs, but I think there's scope for a lot more. So try them out, give us feedback, and show us what can be done. Thank you very much.